Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Warm greetings, everybody, from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the South Pacific. Ngā mihi, and many thanks to the Asian Congress for Media and Communication for inviting me as a keynote speaker for this virtual conference down under. Addressing the conference theme of change, adaptation, and culture, media and communication in pandemic times, my talk will address three main issues: the COVID-19 pandemic and how we are coping with it, a parallel epidemic, a crisis of communication and the surge of disinformation and truth challenges in this age of hatred and intolerance, the global climate crisis and the disproportionate impact this is having on our Asia-Pacific region. And then I will conclude with an overview of some helpful strategies for us as communicators and from my perspective as a journalist and media academic with a mission. However, first a tribute to two extraordinary and inspirational journalists who have shed light on dark places and given the rest of us hope. We recently celebrated when Rappler Chief Executive and media visionary Maria Ressa, along with Russian editor Dmitry Muratov, were named Nobel Peace Prize laureates for fighting courageously to safeguard freedom of expression. The Nobel Committee described them as representatives of all journalists who stand up for this ideal in a world in which democracy and freedom of the press face increasingly adverse conditions. Julie Passetti, Global Director of Research at the International Centre for Journalists, described the choice as a strategic act and a call to action for today's journalists. She highlighted how it had been 85 years since a working journalist had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Their predecessor was a German investigative editor, Karl von Ossietzky, who was made a laureate in 1936 for his burning love for freedom of thought and expression for peace. Ironically, von Ossietzky was languishing in a Nazi concentration camp on a criminal libel charge at the time of the award. His alleged crime: he had exposed the secret rearmament of Germany in breach of the Treaty of Versailles. The second tribute is to a courageous journalist and filmmaker who sadly died at the age of 66 from cancer last month, after 3 decades contributing to his adopted country in Southeast Asia. Max Stahl of Timor-Leste was celebrated around the world for his shocking film footage of the 1991 Santa Cruz massacre in the capital, Dili. The footage was smuggled out to news media and triggered a chain of events leading to Timorese independence. Max bravely filmed the military shootings among the cemetery that killed more than 270 innocent and unarmed men, women, and children during a peaceful protest. He hid the footage under a headstone, and later at night, he returned to the graveyard to recover the evidence. British-born Max Stahl returned to East Timor in 1999 and filmed the referendum on the territory's future, the tumultuous events leading up to independence in 2002, and Timor-Leste's evolution as an independent nation. His documentary was entitled In Cold Blood, The Massacre of East Timor. He was decorated with the Order of Timor-Leste, the country's highest honour for a foreigner, and was awarded Timorese citizenship by the National Parliament in 2019. I had the honour and privilege of meeting him quite by accident in November 2013, when we crossed paths in Timor's second city of Bacau, while I was travelling overland to a Fretilin political conference in a remote town. We travelled together. Later, we invited him to be our keynote speaker at the 20th anniversary conference of Pacific Journalism Review at AUT. He was inspiring and spoke about the painful path of nationhood and his hopes for the eventual independence of West Papua. The common thread linking all 4 of these media communicators, Maria Ressa, Dmitry Muratov, Karl von Ossietzky, and Max Stahl, has been their courageous, determined, and relentless pursuit of truth and justice. The truth, the supreme goal of journalists in holding power to account, is hugely under threat by politicians, demagogues, and charlatans peddling fake news and disinformation. In response to the escalating COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, in mid-February of last year, came a warning by the World Health Organization Secretary General, Dr. Tedros, who declared that we are not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. He added that fake news spreads faster and more easily than this virus. Then in March last year, in response to the escalating crisis, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres identified the new enemy as a growing surge of disinformation. However, the term disinfodemic, which I much prefer, was adopted by the authors of a policy brief for UNESCO to describe the falsehoods fueling the pandemic. This infodemic has been rapidly leading to upheavals in many countries, including here in Aotearoa in the weeks before this conference, with protests, civil disobedience, and attacks on health officials, medical staff, and frontline workers. Such assaults and violent confrontations have taken particularly nasty turns in some of our neighbouring microstates of the South Pacific, notably in Fiji and Papua New Guinea, the largest countries and the biggest economies in the region. Even Australia and now Aotearoa are not immune. Papua New Guinea has a population of 9 million, with a vast economic disparity between the 84% rural population and squatter communities in the urban areas and the elites who benefit from the wealth of extraction industries. Fiji has a population of just over 900,000. Both countries have been epicenters for the virus in the Pacific. Last month, authorities in PNG were forced to abandon mobile health clinics and teams of health workers carrying out COVID-19 vaccination and awareness programs because of the increasingly risky attacks against them. An ambulance crew was attacked. As early as last July, PNG journalists were warning about increasing tensions over misinformation about vaccines and lack of clear communication from health authorities. Rebecca Kuku, writing in The Guardian, cited Caritas Aid Representative Diane Unangi as saying, when messages are not communicated properly, it increases the public health risk. People are avoiding being tested because they are worried that they will be locked up when they hear the word isolation. However, University of Waikato anthropologist Fraser MacDonald points to an even more basic underlying factor. Millions of Papua New Guineans, he says, are not getting vaccinated against COVID because they are terrified of this particular vaccine. He argues that this is not vaccine hesitancy, but full-blown opposition, a genuine antipathy. The key difference is cultural context. MacDonald says that in PNG, there is a fundamentally different view from the Western notion that vaccines are an obvious and intrinsic good. Instead, for many Papua New Guineans, vaccines are a dangerous, unknown, and sinister threat. In recent weeks, there's been a concerted attempt by the PNG Council of Churches, including mainstream faiths such as the Catholic Church, to reduce the so-called sinister beliefs about the vaccine held by many. Sir John Cardinal Reba, for example, has been portrayed as a COVID-19 champion, and he has been at the center of a Love Thy Neighbor promotion campaign with a message of compassion and trust. Media consultant Bob Howarth, a former publisher of the PNG Post-Courier Daily newspaper, expresses concern after watching mainstream media and social media coverage of, as he describes it, the world's most unvaxxed country, Papua New Guinea. Much of his recent consultancy work has involved running Asia-Pacific fact-checking workshops, vital in this age of disinformation and conspiracy theories. He notes the lack of fact-checking expertise both in official government circles and in media generally has become a huge issue. His observation comes from experience in workshops that he ran in Timor-Leste early last year and following on from that, particularly to help the first training he did was for 38 journalists and NGOs. Now, Timor-Leste has one of the highest press freedom rankings in the region. So why, asked Bob Houth, hasn't the basics of fact-checking become part of journalism training in our universities and colleges? The tragedy of COVID is very real, as the ABC correspondent Natalie Whiting reports, as cases have surged across Papua New Guinea, with all major hospitals struggling to cope with the Delta variant. Patients are lying everywhere. The situation is dire, she says. See for yourselves in this report. Not content with the disbanded protests in Port Moresby and Lae, the employee union of the National Capital District Commission took out a lawsuit against their employers in the city, challenging the legality of the no jab, no job policy. While these developments have been disturbing, especially in PNG, where the Johns Hopkins University COVID-19 tracker shows that less than 2% of the people are vaccinated against the virus, and there are grossly underreported almost 33,000 cases and 436 deaths, way below what the actual figures are really. Over the past few weeks, thousands have gathered in breach of COVID-19 restrictions and public health measures to protest against lockdowns and vaccination mandates. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand has described these protests as obviously illegal and morally wrong. However, as the conversation commented in analysis about the balancing act that Prime Minister Ardern needs to uphold freedoms protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, protesting is part of Aotearoa's identity. New Zealanders have protested against poverty, war, nuclear weapons, gender inequality, and the loss of Maori land and customary rights. Several protests, including those against the 1981 Springbok rugby tour, have divided the nation. There is a major difference between Australian and New Zealand authorities in dealing with anti-COVID lockdown and vaccine protests. While in Australia, police have suppressed protests with rubber bullets, tear gas and pepper spray, New Zealand police have avoided suppressing the protests on the day. On November 9th, instead they identified the organisers and quietly later charged them under public health violation regulations. On November the 9th, in a Wellington anti-vaxxer protest march on the Beehive, New Zealand's symbol of democracy, there were scenes reminiscent of Donald Trump's supporters in the lead up to the storming of the US Capitol in Washington on January 6th. Writing in Spin-Off, editor-in-large Toby Manher commented on what he described as a new, ugly and dangerous side to New Zealand. He wrote, "The government and the media were variously decried on signs as Nazis, communists, tyrants, terrorists, rapists, and murderers." He added, "There is sadly no vaccine for brainworms." In a New Zealand Herald article, Nick Durga, who had been working as a fact-checking journalist for nearly 2 years for the Australian Associated Press, admitted that he felt angry about how COVID misinformation was encouraging people to go down deep rabbit holes and splitting up friendships and families. A Media Watch commentary by Hayden Donnell warned there was a danger that too much coverage on conspiracy theories and the activists spreading them meant that mainstream media had the potential to popularize the anti-vaxxers' misleading and distorted messages. Coordinated social media campaigns and email threats or harassing phone calls to journalists or scientists are hardly new. Such campaigns have been prevalent in many jurisdictions, such as in the United States, over topics like climate change, vaccination, and the effects of gun violence. However, a recent survey by Nature magazine has revealed that 2/3 of researchers polled reported negative experiences as a result of their media appearances or their social media comments. And disturbingly, 22% had received threats of physical or sexual violence. Research in New Zealand has shown that conspiracy theories about COVID-19 have dramatically escalated since Delta arrived in the country in late August. The Disinformation Project has been monitoring misinformation and disinformation about the COVID-19 and the vaccine since February 2020. The project's latest report showed an unprecedented and violent trajectory of growth and spread that is increasing, widening, and deepening every week. Much of the content which framed the COVID-19 response is a fight between the individual and the treacherous state that had been repackaged from United States and Australian sources. All 12 of the so-called disinformation dozen who were exposed by the non-profit Research Centre for Countering Digital Hate for providing close to 70% of all disinformation on Facebook and Twitter are in the United States. They are all compromised by their business interests. They were making money out of disinformation. So how do we best deal with this surge of global information pollution? A good starting point in the frameworks analysis provided by First Draft Director Claire Wardle. Although her research originally predated the COVID-19 pandemic, as it dealt with the fake news phenomena of the President Trump era, it is still a really useful tool. First Draft provided a matrix for misinformation and disinformation and showing 3 elements and how they overlap. Dr. Wardle has also developed a typology with 7 types of misinformation and disinformation ranging between low seriousness with satire or parody through to fabricated content at the high end of the scale. We are increasingly seeing the weaponization of context and the use of genuine content, but content that is warped and reframed. Anything with a kernel of truth is far more successful in terms of persuading and engaging people. Along with the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the questions of our time is how to report the existential challenge of climate catastrophe. You notice that how I'm stressing the word catastrophe rather than merely change. That is because for the microstates of the Pacific, it is already viewed as an impending catastrophe. Pacific climate warrior Brianna Fruin advocates for her people vastly better than I can express it. As she says, we are not drowning, we are fighting. Earlier this month, we endured the underwhelming COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, which was condemned as a failure by the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, who branded the conference as a Global North greenwash festival. Ironically, the people most affected by climate change are the Pacific nations, yet only 3 of their leaders could actually be present because of COVID-19 lockdowns and protocols. Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown, among those unable to be there, sent an appeal. He spoke bluntly about the need for dramatic change by the Global North or Western countries for climate financing after years of empty promises. This sums up many of the problems facing the region. The challenge confronting many communication programs and journalism schools located in universities or tertiary institutions is what to do about them, how to tackle the strain of an ever-changing health and science agenda, the deluge of disinformation, and the more rapid than predicted escalation of climate catastrophe. One of the answers is greater specialization and advanced programs rather than just relying on generalist strategies and expecting graduates to fit neatly into already configured newsroom boxes. A report by the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development on balancing freedom of expression with disinformation on the internet has offered a useful framework for responses. It provides a typology of 4 categories: identification, fact-checking and investigation as part of that, responses aimed at producers, distributors, such as law and policy, production responses, including editorial and community standards, and responses aimed at target audiences of disinformation campaigns, and this actually provides very much for empowerment. Before I explore some specific examples of strategies, I would like to offer a context of my own trajectory. As a journalist, I've lived and worked in 9 countries, mostly in developing nations in Africa and in the Asia Pacific. This has shaped my worldview as a journalist and academic, especially having worked as an editor with both a Western global news agency, Agence France-Presse, based in Paris, and global South news services such as Gemini. I've written several books on the politics and media of the region, many of them incorporating my professional experience. Also, I've developed several theories and models that I've explored in a series of papers and applied in my teaching, notably a Talanoa journalism model, a homegrown Pacific approach to practice and research. My emphasis has been on project journalism, creating high-quality coverage of issues and challenging assignments on university platforms with high standards of journalistic integrity, and to foster multi-university collaboration across national boundaries. This is captured in my book, Don't Spoil My Beautiful Face, about activism, media, and politics in the Asia-Pacific region. Over the years, we have collaborated with partners across Asia and the Pacific, from China to Tahiti. Our strategies have included a 3-year climate change project, Bearing Witness, a Pacific Media Watch project, mostly in the partnership with the University of the South Pacific, a weekly radio program, Southern Cross, at 95 BFM station at the University of Auckland, and a climate and COVID project with Internews. And more recently, since 2018, a collaboration with the showcase platform, The Junction, established with the Journalism Education and Research Association of Australia, JIRA. I would like to round off this address with a tribute to all those Asia-Pacific media people who are working hard against great odds in this pandemic and climate crisis era and are making remarkable use of storytelling to try to make a difference for their people. Take Scott Whitey, for example. Just a few weeks ago, he was the deputy news editor of Papua New Guinea's major television network, MTV News. He resigned so that he could get closer to grassroots communities to tell their real stories and to get a better deal for them. He uses a variety of platforms, articles on his WordPress blog, videos on social media, his educator skills, and his presence on the ground to know what is really happening. He says, we have to write our own narrative of positivity through the stories we tell and the stories we encourage our children to listen to. We have to pass on the wisdom of our ancestors to the generation of the future. We have to be the conduit for that change we want to see. Among his recent narratives are his personal experience nursing both of his aging parents back to health from COVID-19, a harrowing tale, but one of great compassion. Then there is the team in PNG involved in the ABC's Sisters, Let's Talk, sharing health and survival knowledge with mothers and other young women. And here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there is the Let's Talanoa series with Dr. Lucina Nakid and Rocky Lavia, 30-second video clips with key health information. These are the sorts of innovative initiatives that communication schools should be partnering with, real media making a difference. Finally, in the context of our conference theme of change and culture, I leave you with this thought from Scott Whitey. His question is, what if we all achieved creative insanity? What would your answer be as communicators? Thanks very much. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you for listening to me.